This chapter talks about all of the atypical bacterial pathogens, things that are not gram-negative or gram-positive or bacillus-shaped or coccus-shaped. So our first video, we're going to talk about the spirochetes. So remember, spirochetes have these kind of corkscrew shape. Bacteria can kind of drill their way into parts of the body, like into joints or into different tissues or organs. So a lot of spirochetes can form these very long-term infections. They don't necessarily replicate really fast right away. They replicate slow and cause these long-term progressive infections. A lot of spirochetes can affect multiple animals, so they can affect humans, but they also can infect other animals as well. So I guess you can kind of count these guys as zoonotic, although they don't only transmit animal to human, they can also spread human to human. The thing about spirochetes is that most of them are strict pathogens, but they don't just like grow or survive on fomites for very long. They need live cells in order to reproduce. This also makes it really hard to study them, because we can't just grow them on a petri dish. They need live cells to cultivate and grow. In order to study spirochetes, we need live animals, live model systems, and a lot of times we have to use like monkeys or animals that people don't necessarily want to have to work with in the lab. So there's a lot we don't know about spirochetes, and it's been very difficult to really study these. So our first class of spirochetes are the treponemas, and there's one main human pathogen. It's called Treponema pallidum. So Treponema pallidum, there's many subspecies of this organism, but the main disease we see in humans is syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease that spreads human to human only via sexual transmission. Treponema pallidum is extremely fastidious and it's very sensitive, so it doesn't survive on fomites and you can't get it through food or ingestion or inhalation. It only can spread sexual person to person, but it's also transplacental, so it can spread from mother to fetus. Here's a picture of Treponema pallidum under the microscope. All spirochetes look like this under the microscope. They look all wavy looking. So syphilis is a disease that has many stages to it. And it's just like all spirochetes, it's a very long-term progressive disease. So the first stage is called primary syphilis. Okay, so this is the first initial signs and symptoms. So after the incubation period, the person will then exhibit primary syphilis. So the main sign of primary syphilis is there's a lesion at the site of inoculation. So usually on the genitals, or it could also be in the mouth if it's spread by oral sex. And you see what's called a chancre. Now, we heard about this other disease that Haemophilus causes called chancroid. Haemophilus chancre is a very hard, tough lesion, but the syphilis chancre is non-painful. It's not painful at all, but it's not like as hard as the Haemophilus chancre. So that's how you could tell the difference between the two. Now the chancre, in syphilis, there could be some fluid that leaks out of it. And this fluid is extremely contagious. So when this person has this lesion, it's extremely easy to spread the syphilis from person to person. Now most people, if they see a lesion like this, they're going to go to the doctor and get treatment. At this stage, the syphilis is very treatable, all right? And it's really easy to kill the syphilis at this point. We usually just use penicillin or, almost any antibiotic, okay? Syphilis is not highly resistant, especially in this early stage. It's going to be very easy to treat because the syphilis is localized. However, if the person does not seek out treatment, after a short period of time, the chancre is going to spontaneously heal on its own, and the syphilis spirochete is going to travel somewhere else in the body and is going to remain dormant. And that's the thing about syphilis, is there's not a lot of it in the blood when it enters the body. There's just a few cells, but these cells don't just go away. The immune system has a hard time destroying destroying them because they can hide and burrow in little crevices in the body. So they can lay dormant for a while. Now later on, the syphilis is going to come out of dormancy, and the second stage is secondary syphilis. The key sign of secondary syphilis is a very characteristic rash. The rash usually presents on the palms or the soles of the feet, which is kind of a weird place to see a rash. So it's very characteristic of syphilis. Now at this point, the syphilis is rapidly multiplying in the bloodstream. All right, and it's taken a while to get to this point where it's ready to replicate. So along with the rash, the person will usually feel a fever, a headache, and a sore throat. Now the rash is not painful or really itchy. It just presents as spots. And again, it will usually go away on its own, and then the syphilis can go back into latency. Also during secondary syphilis, the disease is still pretty treatable. We could still use antibiotics like penicillin at this stage to treat the syphilis. So hopefully if a person sees these signs, they'll go to the doctor and get treatment. If not, the syphilis will enter a period of latency, and this latent period can last decades. All right, sometimes it can last 20 to 30 years. Okay, before it comes out again. And then the syphilis comes back again. It is now tertiary syphilis. Now, tertiary syphilis is the most severe form of the disease. At this point, the spirochete has replicated so much, it's no longer treatable at this point. And there could be damage to multiple tissues and organs. All right, so you might have heard that syphilis can actually cause nerve damage. And there is evidence of people going kind of mad or crazy because the syphilis damages nerves in the brain. Another key sign are these things called gumas, and they're kind of like little tumors that are on the skin and on the exterior tissue. So that's another sign of tertiary syphilis. Syphilis is one of those congenital diseases. It's transplacental. It can pass from mother to fetus. Now, if a baby is born having syphilis, the main signs and symptoms are usually going to be in the skin and in the mouth and nose area. One of the key signs is these barrel-like teeth. There's a classic sign of syphilis called Hutchinson's teeth, which is one of those classic signs of syphilis, congenital syphilis. If we want to diagnose syphilis, now it's very difficult to observe syphilis treponema under the microscope because treponema are hard to stain. They're not really gram-negative, gram-positive. You can't really use a gram stain. So instead we have to use something called a silver stain. This image shows a silver stain. It's actually very difficult to do this type of stain. So microscopy is not the best for observing treponema. We usually will use an ELISA to see if an individual has antibodies against treponema. Because if they have antibodies, it's a sign that they probably have been infected or are infected with the syphilis. Now, there are some Treponema pallidum subspecies that do not transmit sexually, but instead they transmit from skin contact. So especially in children, when children are playing and they're usually it's in an unsanitary condition where a child touches another child's wound or skin. And now these subspecies, there's 3 diseases they can cause. Buergel, which is an infection mostly, like I said, of the skin because it spreads through skin-to-skin contact, but it also could affect the mouth and the nasal cavity. Now, all of these Treponema subspecies are found mostly in tropical environments. They're endemic to tropical regions. So this is Buergel. There's also Yaws. Similarly, Yaws also attacks mostly the skin and mostly the oral or the nasal cavity. So you might see this characteristic nose. This is definitely a Treponema infection, but similarly the Hutchinson's teeth. But you also may see some disorders in the bone. And then the final one is Pinta. Similar to the others, it's mostly only found in tropical regions. It spreads through skin lesions. Pinta mostly is limited onto the skin. And you see these are like the gumas that you see with syphilis, all right? These little tumors that are on the skin.